Stirring the Pot with Florence Fabricant. I am Jennifer Brando from Guildhall, and we're very excited to have you all here today. This is the second in our series this summer of Stirring the Pot. A few weeks ago, we had Florence interviewing the ladies of the LVIS, Ladies Village Improvement Society, about their new cookbook. And this week, we are super excited to have Alan and Michael Stillman, the Restaurateurs, father and son team behind TGI Fridays, Smith & Wollensky, and the Quality Branded Restaurant Group, and a lot more. So they're going to tell us all about that. But we do want to thank our sponsors, Chufo Cabinetry, who have been the lead sponsor of Stirring the Pot since 2014, and let you know that the third in our series will have a special guest chef TBA. We will let you know that soon, but that will be on September 27th, Sunday at 11 a.m. After the talk today, there will be a Q&A. It will be done through the chat feature on Zoom. So if you have a question, you can open up the chat and type it in there, and we will be reading off the questions and answering them. Feel free, if you have a question during the talk, to type it in the chat. We won't answer till the end, but if you are thinking of something and want to type it down now, you can. And so please welcome Florence Fabricant, our fantastic board member and food and wine writer for the New York Times, host and creator of this series, and Alan and Michael Stillman.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I welcome everybody on this beautiful Sunday in the Hamptons. And thank you so much to my audience for taking the time to learn something that's going to be really interesting about the restaurant business and a particular restaurant group, and also with a look, I think, very timely as to the future of the restaurant business, as these veterans, Alan and Michael Stillman, can share with us. So thank you, Alan and Michael, for taking part of your day to do this for us and for Guildhall. And as Fareed Zakaria would say, let's get started. I think first, I'd like to talk about your particular history as restaurateurs. Alan, could you give us a snapshot of how you got started and when Michael joined you in the company?
I got started so many moons ago that it's called ancient history.
Right.
Fridays was just a bar on the corner of First Avenue and 63rd Street. It was called the Good Tavern. It was a place where I had a drink, and I had nothing involved with the restaurant business, but walked in one day, had a beer, and decided that that would be a good way to meet a lot of good-looking women. There were many, many stewardesses and models that lived in that area. And lo and behold, I asked the bartender, and 2 weeks later, I owned a restaurant and bar called the Good Tavern. Luckily enough, it was purely luck, I called it TGI Fridays, and the rest really is ancient history.
Why did you decide to call it TGI Fridays?
I think, well, why not? It was an expression of my college days, which goes back 7,000 years, ancient history again, and was something that everybody knew and knew what it meant. It meant to come and have a great time on Friday, and certainly did work.
Yeah, it sure did. People still talk about it. I mean, it still exists, right?
About 1,400 of them.
Yeah, yeah. And how long did it take after that for you to open another restaurant?
About between 2 and 3 years. And obviously the next restaurant was called Thursdays, and then Wednesdays and Tuesdays, which followed upon them maybe 1 year apart.
Wow. But those have disappeared. And
I think most of them have disappeared, although we still have a restaurant where the original Thursdays was. In fact, we've been in the space for 40 years through several iterations, and I went through plans recently and pulled up Thursdays plans from the mid-70s of this space, trying to find something. So, you know, it's still part of our history, I think.
it's interesting. And then how soon after that did Smith & Wollensky come along? I think that was in the late 70s, was it not?
Yeah, the TGI Fridays was 65, and the first Smith & Wollensky was 1977. So
Right.
that's medieval history. How's that? Except that's still going.
Ancient.
a whole bunch of licensees all over the world, from Taiwan and London, or Las Vegas and Miami. And Smith Wollensky in New York City was 1977. And with a little bit of luck, we may be able to get it up and running here in the next year.
Mm-hmm. And who are Smith and Wollensky?
Smith and Wollensky were the first two chefs at Smith and Wollensky. They were invention of my mind. There was no Smith, there was no Wollensky, and we just picked the names out of a New York City phone book.
But then after that, you named a restaurant for your accountants or your lawyers or something?
Lawyers, our state liquor authority lawyers were Maloney and Porcelli. That was the name of the law firm. In actuality, we had to ask them to use the name, and we paid them $5,000 a year to use the name. I don't know whether we're still paying them or not, but that's where the name came from.
Yeah. But there was always, I always got the sense, and I've known you going back at least to Smith and Wollensky, I've always had the sense that whatever you do with a certain sense of wit and whimsy and style as well. These are important factors. It's not just about the food.
Well, it's part of the reason that many people go into the restaurant business as a business, is that on the outside looking in, it's hard to see, but it is an inventive business, and it's something that has some charm to it. And those things, the names of the restaurants and also the methodology of serving good food, is something that you don't find in most businesses. It's an artistic business to a great degree.
Yeah. And you've joined with some important designers in order to achieve that in your restaurant.
Designers and chefs, absolutely.
And chefs.
Yeah. I can cook one thing, and all I can do is throw some pasta in a boiling water, so I better have some chefs going back. Although Michael is now a cook, I can't cook a thing.
So Michael, when did you really get involved in the company? And was this something that you wanted to make your career, or were you dragged in kicking and screaming?
You know, I was pushed away kicking and screaming. My father said, do anything but. You know, I grew up around it, so it was always of interest to me, but I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And, you know, my father has a very artistic bend, so I loved art. I loved a lot of things. I was involved in a lot of politics. But when I got out of college, I was feeling out different things, and I ended up, you know, through, you know, knowing the business, working for Danny Myers. I interned, I had basically no experience. I ran food, I checked notes, I worked in the back of house, but I fell in love with it a little bit after growing up with it and seeing what Danny was doing. And I started to work in some of our openings just to get a feel whether this was a career path I was interested. My father said, look, I don't think you should do this, but if you're interested, you've got to do restaurant openings and understand what it's really all about. And I really fell in love with the whole dynamics of that. I think the balance between business and creativity and the variety of people, the diversity of people in the restaurant business was something that really spoke to me. The tremendous range of backgrounds with everyone you were working with, I just loved. So I've been doing that, you know, almost 20 years now, since 2002.
Which was the restaurant that you would claim to be the first on your own?
It would probably be Quality Meats. Quality Meats was really, you know, I worked on some of our sort of reinventing some of our older products and stuff, but it was really Quality Meats. We had a restaurant that was very successful there for many years, the Manhattan Ocean Club. But after a 20 some odd year run, it had sort of run its course. But we had a young dynamic chef, my partner now, almost, I think 18 years, Craig Kakatsu. And I knew I had this young chef who was so great. And, you know, I had a young architecture firm that I'd fallen in love with, the Abraco, who had just started to do a couple projects. And I said, we've got this young, interesting group. Let's try and do something in this space. And that was one I think I was really involved in. And it, you know, knock on wood, turned out to be a big success and really helped me sort of, you know, go from there. But, really touching upon a lot of the things that my father's always championed in the restaurant business. I think, while it was really, my project in lead, I think it was inspired by all the things that I learned growing up and then working for many years with my father in the way he saw our business, a sort of younger generation's interpretation of that perspective, if you will.
For those of our viewers who are not familiar with Quality Meats, why don't you describe the restaurants? So to give them a snapshot, because it's, to me anyway, it's not what I would call a cookie cutter steakhouse.
Well, I'm glad you say that. I think that was our goal at the time. We think of it, it's a sort of meat-centric steak restaurant, but I think our thought process was to do something very modern and different at the time, to do something that could draw a range of guests, a more diverse audience, a more female audience than traditional steakhouses, to bring a real sort of industrial look at the time, which was very different, and a more modern interpretation of a lot of the food, but still hearkening back to a lot of the history of, American design traditions and the history of a lot of American foods. So while we wanted it to be contemporary, we still wanted it to be fun and to have a sense of humor. And we really wanted it to be elevated, but not fussy in both the design and the food. So in some ways it was sort of modern, but in some ways it was very stripped down and could still be kind of fun and tongue in cheek. And I think we hopefully hit that balance. It's now been, 16 years and, up until this year has consistently been in the top 50 grossing restaurants in the country for the last dozen. So it's been very successful and we really enjoyed it. And it's managed to now sort of feel like it's past just being a kind of new, cool restaurant. At 16 years, we feel like it's starting to have real longevity to it.
Well, what was interesting to me about the design and the approach was it had that, you said industrial, but I think it was probably the first of now quite a few restaurants that, or steak restaurants that sort of want you to think you're in a butcher shop. And I think you have a lot of those kinds of elements, the overhead racks that are used and all of the implements and everything else, and the white tile and so forth. I think it was pretty new at the time, was it not?
Yeah, I think we were, one of the forward-thinking people with that, and I think it came a little bit out of, Alan's history. The name came from an old Quality Meats sign that was in one the original Smith & Lenski's. And when Aberco and I and the chef were talking about different ideas, the sign struck upon us, and Albany's Meats, which is one of the old classic butcher shops of New York, was right down the street from them in Nolita. And we sort of thought about the history of that in New York and how that could be reinterpreted in a modern way. And to us, it felt a little stripped down, but then we layered on some sort of fun to it and some sort of modern approaches to the food. So I think that definitely was a big piece of it. And I think it's been copied a lot on the design front. And I think we balanced out a lot that what we liked about that was that there was still a sense of history, that we wanted it to be contemporary and still timeless. And that's a tough balance when you're trying to be modern. But that hook, the history of butchers, both in New York City and steak restaurants, really became a great thread to sort of give it that timeless element to it.
Right. And you've taken the Quality name and used it in other iterations and other styles of restaurants, have you not?
Yeah, we now have a Quality Italian, a Quality Bistro, a Quality Eats. They each have their own interpretation. I think, for us, some of it was this jumping off point of sort of an American sentiment, a sort of timeless American sentiment, to a style of food with a sort of modern approach and a lot of fun. And I think that ties in the history of TGI Fridays and Smith Wollensky's. We looked at Italian-American dining and said, how do we look at the history of that thread in America and do it with a modern sentiment, but also tie into that history. And with Eats, it was sort of doing that neighborhood restaurant. And with Bistro, the same thing. Each one had a thread of both, America and New York being such a melting pot and bringing all these cultures in, how those cultures and those restaurants got defined in the history of New York and how we could reinterpret that history a little bit. So it was less, us traveling around the world, but more us traveling around New York and the history of New York and how these different sort of restaurants came into place and these cuisines came into place in New York and how we sort of channeled that history in our own sort of modern fun interpretation. So really, it was tied a lot to the history of restaurants in New York City and the way we sort of thought of each iteration.
Well, the fun interpretations in quality Italian, why don't you tell our audience what some of those dishes are? Because some of them are familiar but new.
For sure. And I think, our partners at the time, Scott and Angie, who are chefs who have a great restaurant, we're partners with Don Angie in the West Village. They had such a great eye and a feel for modern Italian-American cooking. They grew up with it and they had such an interesting sentiment. So taking chicken Parmesan, which is one of those very, Italian-American dishes,
Nobody calls it Parmesan. They only just call it Parm, and you know what they're talking about.
They took that idea and they sort of developed how to make it in a more fun Abbondanza way. They recreated it almost in a pizza scope, but they brought in sort of fun, sharp little styles from other food. The idea of bringing like a Calabrian chili honey so that you would have honey with chicken, which is very, strange in Italian-American cooking, but works for that dish. We did a porterhouse stuffed agnolotti using like different homemade pasta techniques, but sort of taking some of the like classic Italian-American bistecca Fiorentina and reinterpreting how it was. So like some very modern food approaches, but some very fun winks at things and a little bit of an international bend to it. So we have a sausage and pepper toast, which reminds you a little bit of shrimp toast if you've had in Chinese cooking, but also really plays with the sausage and peppers that from Italian-American cooking. So just like a very interesting modern play on a very classic dish.
Interesting. And then you went from there to Quality Eats.
Yep. So Quality Eats, was sort of our neighborhood, more casual restaurant. We sort of like thought about the little steak joints of Europe and also the little, neighborhood spots of New York. And we really wanted to bring in a lot of sort of even more wink and fun to the design. So we worked with a new design group, Reunion Goods and Services, and they came up with a really highly stylized, it always reminds me of kind of like a younger New Yorker cartoon sort of vision of the look and feel. And I think it's really fresh and fun and still a lot of the same idea. How do you take a lot of those classic dishes and give them a sense of fun, but in this case, make them a little more accessible and a little more neighborhoody?
Well, I think one of the key elements that you incorporated into the Quality Eats, and I believe you have more than one of them, is the unusual steak cuts, the kinds of steaks that, the chef or the butcher might say for themselves because there may be only one or two per animal and they're cheaper and they're less prized, let's say, than a New York strip or a ribeye or fillet, but they have incredible flavor. And I think you've introduced a lot of people to those kinds of steaks.
I'm glad to hear that. I think, we were thrilled to do that. I think it was a thread that we saw in a lot of cooking more and more now. It's exciting that I think a lot of chefs are approaching different, cuts of animals, different ways. I think they're thinking more holistically about food, and there's such interesting opportunities. So Chef Craig, my partner, really had a great eye for that, looking at other cooking like Korean cooking and short ribs and how you could reimagine cutting a cut that you might not see traditionally in American cooking, or a bavette that you would see in French cooking, and how to sort of, work with it in a way that's fun and introduce it, in a more American setting. And you're seeing that more and more in all sorts of styles of cooking. You see lamb neck on restaurant menus, and very corporate people eating lamb neck and it being the signature dish of restaurants, and it's an amazing cut, and it's things that you wouldn't have seen before. I think people are more open to it, and I think it's interesting and a little egalitarian too. So it was really fun to start to think in those ways. And I think a lot of it was us thinking about what a lot of other cultures use that we don't as Americans, and understanding how to reinterpret that and reintroduce those things.
Right. And then your latest is Quality Bistro.
Yep. So Quality Bistro, we opened just in late January. Interesting timing, but it off to a fabulous start, and we're excited. We'll be reopening for outdoor dining in about a week and a half. Doing some delivery, which will be fun and interesting. We'll be doing more of a small, almost like an intermission menu, if you will, until we sort of get to next spring and reopen the restaurant in full. But it's a very dynamic setting, a beautiful space that I thought was tremendously done by Abrico. And our chefs, I think, are doing a great job at sort of thinking about the brasserie and bistro world, particularly in how it looks in New York City, and sort of bringing our vision of that in. And we had some really fun signature dishes that I thought were fantastic, and I'm really excited to get it back out there when the moment is right.
It is a gorgeous restaurant. It's got this greenhouse look, and then kind of a sunny room off to the side, beautiful bar. It really is smashing looking, and it's a pity that it barely got its feet wet before it had to shut down. Are any of your other restaurants open for outdoor dining now?
Yeah, we are open in 4 restaurants, Don Angie, 2 of the Quality Eats, and Quality Italian. And we'll be opening Quality Bistro and hopefully a couple others. Outdoor dining is, a helpful opportunity for a lot of restaurants right now that they desperately need. It's still challenging, obviously. It has a lot of challenges, and it's limited in its time and its abilities. So we've sort of worked through how to get it going judiciously, but it's been a tremendous feeling just to have customers back even near the restaurants, so to speak, maybe not in the restaurants, but near the restaurants, but to be able to cook for people again, to see people smiling or almost see them smiling, to see them interacting is really, after many months, really, satisfying. I don't think it answers the call enough by even half for what restaurants need, particularly in New York City, from a financial standpoint. But it's just great to see some of our people back working again, and to see people out enjoying restaurants again.
So Alan, with your long history, going back to ancient and medieval times, the situation today is probably something you could never have contemplated, correct?
That is 100% correct. And the problem with it is that 6 months ago, both Michael and I said, okay, what are we going to do 2 months from now? And then 4 months ago, we said, what are we going to do next month? Anyway, we're now at 6 months out. And a good friend of mine says, nobody knows nothing. And I think he is really correct. It's a problem not only in the restaurant business, but a huge problem for New York City, that the next steps to be taken to make New York what it was, which will take many years, but at least to get started, have not been spoken to yet. So we're stuck. We are sitting waiting until the city itself has the ability to say, okay, here's the way we open museums, which they partly undertook last week, which is great. And here's what we're going to do for the theater and Broadway and the operas and all the cultural places, and get all of the things that make New York the most exciting city in the world to where it's going to come back and when it's going to come back. So we just have to sit and wait for that to happen.
Well, at the moment, I mean, and not just New York City, but you think about where we are on Long Island right now, and the restaurant situation. Maybe the restaurants are a little less dependent on cultural institutions to drive business and to have people dining out. But at the same time, this not knowing what the next step might be is really, must be just horrendously difficult. And I mean, are you just hemorrhaging money right and left during this time? I mean, how does a group with a restaurant group like yours, I imagine there's some kind of cushion, but even your one-off restaurateur, how long are they going to be able to survive, if at all?
I think that's a great question. The answer is it's a more difficult word than hemorrhaging. More money is flowing out from us and from almost every restaurateur that I know in a financial way this has never occurred before, because it occurred in one day. In one day, we took a business that was paying out more than $30 million a year to 1,200 employees, and that was earning for these employees probably $20 to $25 million in tips. So $55 million that was flowing from a small business, and we are a small business. We are 8 different restaurants in New York, and each one is qualified according to the government as a small business. That small business was pumping $55 million a year into the New York economy. So you can imagine what the other probably 30 or 35,000 restaurants were doing. And yet we have not been able to overcome that. It's a long way to go.
Yeah, I think, frankly, I think basically all these restaurants are already broke. There was, I think JP Morgan or someone did something back in April where they looked and said the average restaurant across the country carries 16 days of cash on hand. You know, basically any restaurant in New York City, not New York State, is already broke. It's a question of, you know, federal aid. It's a question of what other things can sustain. They're well past having any money, you know, regardless of even intervention from landlords or anything else. They're, you know, they're basically out of cash. So it's already happened. You're just not seeing it yet because no one said we're broke, but they're all broke. So it's a question of how to get as many as possible back.
I'm really surprised about what I've heard about the degree to which most landlords are unwilling to be flexible on rent for restaurants. It seems to me that having a restaurant open in your building, your property, or your whatever is better than having one shuttered, at least generating some revenue. And from what I've heard, the landlords are not cooperating. Is that just rumor, or is that true?
I wouldn't say, I would say it's definitely more nuanced than that. I mean, most of our landlords have been receptive to discussing a lot of things. I definitely think the landlords that I've worked with truly understand the value of restaurants and see them, you know, frankly, as being of even more value in the future. In terms of retail tenancy and what they're going to need to drive people back to New York. I think the numbers are so stark for all businesses, including real estate, that I think they are still, like hoteliers, like everyone else, wrapping their heads around the extreme nature of this. And it happened, I think, the most suddenly for restaurants, and it's slowly trickling up the ladder. So I think it's hard for a lot of landlords. They're negotiating between banks. The banks are negotiating with the federal government. They're going back and forth between us. They have some occupancy, but not others. A lot of them may be dealing with certain retail, but not restaurants, dealing with commercial tenants who are still making money. So I think it's challenging. I don't think they recognize or understand how daunting an economic situation it is for restaurants, because I don't think they have had to dig into our economics in the past. But I don't think it's necessarily out of a lack of understanding of how viable and important we are. I think it's taking a long process for landlords and everyone really to understand what this new norm needs to look like to make everyone successful. And I think that's still an open question mark. So I think there's been a lot of frustration from restaurant tours who are really feeling the heat immediately. And I understand that, and I feel some of that frustration, but I also have seen genuinely that landlords, a lot that I see, they want to support, they recognize, how important we are. I don't think they understand how dire the economic situation is yet.
Interesting. But let's take it for a minute from the standpoint of the customer. Okay, you understand the protocols of dining outside, wear a mask when you're not eating, tables are separated. In some instances, there's even a plexiglass barrier between tables. Servers are masked. So do you think that customers should feel confident about dining outdoors at this time? Should feel that they are not risking their health and safety in so doing? What measures are you taking? Well, because we'll get to indoor in a minute, but for outdoor dining, what are the measures that you're taking?
Look, I would say nothing is definitive right now, but everything that I've read and the people I've talked to in the medical community, restaurants feel like outdoors is definitely, if done appropriately and correctly, is definitely mitigates a huge amount of the risk for COVID. And I feel like for the vast majority of restaurants that are handling their measures appropriately, you've seen very little issues. So I do think customers should have a lot of confidence in outdoor dining. I think they have to, take a look around and recognize and make sure that they feel that the place they're going to is taking, appropriate precautions. But I think the vast majority are, that I've seen, especially in the New York area. And I think you've seen the numbers. And I think there's been proof in, when done correctly, it really is, I would say fairly safe from what everyone can see at this point. So I have a lot of confidence in outdoor dining. And if done correctly, I would hope the customers would too.
How far would you go in policing your customers, say if they're not wearing a mask or other issues?
There's a balance, obviously, and I think everyone has to think about it. But I think at this point, first and foremost, our concern is got to be for our employees and for the comfort and safety of them, and that means taking pretty stringent precautions. And I think we have tried to, as politely and nicely, enforce those precautions for our staff members and therefore our customers too. And I think almost everyone that we've seen has been very open to it. I think it's all on how you do it, but we are pretty specific, in the things we ask our customers to do. And we've been talking with other restaurateurs who feel strongly about how to do things the right way. And I think that's, frankly, to instill confidence for our employees, to instill confidence for the customers there. And I think there is a way to do it. I think we worried a lot about the sense of fun and the relaxation of restaurants. And obviously that is challenging with these things. There's no doubt about that. But I think you can still accomplish it. And I'm seeing it in our outdoor dining. I think we are being fairly judicious and careful, and people are still having a lot of fun and enjoying themselves. So I think it's very doable. I think people who say, you can't have fun and enjoy restaurants and do some of these things, I think that's inaccurate.
And do you have a plan of action set out for indoor when that's permitted?
We do. We do. Obviously, I think indoor has a lot more challenges. It depends on the area, it depends on the physical makeup of the restaurant itself, the airflow, the this, the that. And I think, frankly, there's a lot of just question marks with indoor dining. You're seeing it around the country, and you've definitely seen, certain issues pop up, but you've also seen a lot of areas and a lot of cities where issues really haven't popped up. It's done appropriately. I think treatments and vaccines are going to be very important to really instilling confidence in indoor dining. And I think to some degree that makes sense for sure. I think there's still measures we can take. And obviously it's a careful balance. We want people back in the restaurants. We want our people working. We want the restaurants to be successful, but we want it to be a safe environment for our employees, for our customers, and we want to do the right things. So we are trying to, as I think a lot of people are, find that fine line in a very tough situation. And I don't think there will be a crystal clear, it's black and it's white moment. I think it's going to be thoughtful and careful and pay attention and think about a lot of the details and watch a lot of the numbers. And I think it's that case, not just in New York City, but around the country. And I think you're seeing some states, some restaurants, cities, are handling it different ways. And, it's a tough balance. I think ones that are being careful and judicious are having some success, but even then there are definitely challenges. You're seeing it with schools and indoor dining. So it's a tough balance right now. I don't know how you feel about that.
I think we've yet to see what will happen around the world with indoor dining. There's no question that the difference between, well, let's just say Manhattan to the rest of the world is night and day, because Manhattan is a very distinct, different purpose with 1 million people a day that are coming in from other places to work in Manhattan, and 50 million people last year coming as tourists. You put those two things together and we have a definitively different problem than the rest of the world has.
Particularly with more people working at home, you're not going to have, I don't think, right away, the density of, say, lunchtime and happy hour kind of situations with your restaurants in the Midtown area.
That is correct.
Or in any area for that matter.
No, I think Midtown Manhattan is a tremendous challenge because of the actuality of office workers that will not be there, whether it's 20% or 50%, no one knows, but there certainly will be less of the crowd impact for lunches and happy hours and many things like that. We're going to have a different city, and I hope that it turns out to be a better city, but it's definitely going to be different, that's for sure.
Yeah, at least for this fall and winter, I think.
Yeah.
And look, it's challenging. I've talked a lot to Andrew Ridgey from the New York Hospitality Alliance, who's gotten a lot of press recently, pushing. And I know there are so many small restaurateurs. They don't have the ability, as I said, they're already broke. I think people don't recognize that there is an insane balance. Their businesses will simply be done. So without real federal aid, trying to balance out the needs of those restaurants, the economic needs, and frankly, the economic needs of all the $15 to $20 an hour people who work for those restaurants, with the complexities of indoor dining is tremendously challenging on both sides. And on both sides, there are medical risks, there are human risks, taking out even the economic risks, right? There's restaurants have tremendous amount in New York City and New York State, tremendous amount of low-income employees who need them to survive, to pay medical bills, do things they need. So it is challenging on both sides. And I think, it requires aid, it requires government intervention. It's too complex an issue, and I don't think it's an either or.
No, I agree. And let's say you're opening for indoor dining and you've got 100 seats, which is, I think, pretty reasonable when you're talking about your restaurants. For for indoor dining, you'd have to reduce that to how many?
Yes, so I mean, it depends on where and what state, but there are states that have done 50.
No, talking about New York.
Well, in New York City right now, there is no indoor dining
Right, but
in New York State. I believe it's 50% in most places. So if you had 100 seat restaurant, you'd basically be looking at a 50 seat capacity. Obviously, most restaurants run on a 5 to 10% profit margin. So, reducing your top line by half means you're broke already. Reducing it by 25% means you're basically broke. So I think the reality is, even getting open at 50%, it's cash. It helps you spin the wheels, but it's nowhere near what restaurants that run on such a tight margin need.
And it's perpetuates itself in Manhattan because all of the things that are more expensive in Manhattan really continue, such as insurance, such as utilities, and as you mentioned, Florence, rent. You put those three things together, you're already talking about 20% of the cost of running a business, and they're not going down.
They're going up.
They're going up. So
the insurance brokers want a 20% premium if they'll even sign a restaurant.
Outdoor cafes and 50% capacity indoors will not help. They'll just cause people to go broke slower.
that's one way of looking at it.
Well,
Yeah.
you definitely have to
I
help.
think that's unfair to say it won't help. It'll help.
Oh, it'll help
for
sure.
sure,
No question.
But it's treading water, and I think it may give people and politicians the false sense that it can actually, make money for these people. And I think that's one of the concerns I think the restaurateurs have, is that in doing that, people say, oh, well, now you have a delivery and you have some outdoor dining. So doesn't that, make up for the indoor dining? And the tiny percentage of what that brings in financially for a restaurant in comparison, I don't think they have any sense of that. For getting us, see the little mom and pop guy, it's barely, touches the surface for most of them. And I think they mean it with goodwill, but the concern is then that the real aid that's needed for a lot of these people, may not be met because they'll feel that that's resolving the issue. And it really needs long-term systemic changes to make these profitable entities.
And don't forget, I mentioned tips before, but that's not a small item. It's a huge, huge item. 15 to 20% of the volume in New York City sit-down restaurants, that's billions and billions of dollars, was also being supplemented by 20% tips to the staff. And therefore, they were able to pay their rent and buy their groceries and have a life. Those 20% that is not figured in any numbers, and no one is talking about that, because the general restaurants that they talk about include fast food restaurants where there is no tipping. But in the sit down, especially in New York City and especially in Manhattan restaurants, that's a big amount of money, and the restaurateurs don't get it. The people that work for them get it. So we really need to do something to get those people back to work.
Yeah, and at the same time, if you talk about outdoor, there are not many restaurants that can have the outdoor capacity that they have indoors. I mean, there are a few, but talking about outdoor and potentially indoor dining at reduced capacity, does this affect your menu in the sense, do you want to turn your tables faster, have a shorter menu so people don't linger as much? But at the same time, what happens to the golf party?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And I think also, obviously, turn times and keeping to more regimented times helps with social distancing. There's a reality that keeping to tighter time frames, is part of trying to not have people waiting, not have people congregating, to time it out, to make it the most safe process. So I think there's a reality where, for a restaurateur, we want to be, we want to have the same warm, gregarious style that we've always had running restaurants in New York City, but there were a lot of new demands to keep it healthy, quote unquote. And those demands often require certain rules and certain differences that I think customers aren't used to. but it's impossible to sort of, meet the demands of the neighborhood and the health requirements of, say, not having people congregate and wait for a table, but not have people limited in their turn times, right? There are realities to that. So, we've tried to balance out people understanding both economically for restaurants and just from a current health perspective, that some of the new processes are just a necessary fact of life without losing the warmth of what restaurants are. And I think it can be accomplished, but definitely that's part of it.
I have one more question before we find out whether we have questions from viewers. And my question has to do with what I've heard from a number of restaurateurs and even top flight chefs, that the wave of the future is this so-called fast casual format, whereby it's basically counter service, and you don't really have waiters. You can eat food on the spot when that's permitted, or take it outside, or take it home. But it's basically the counter service format. What do you think of that as the new normal?
I hope they're wrong, number one, that's for sure. You and I come from a generation that has been going out for years and years and years, and sit-down restaurants with everything that goes with it is what we are looking to reopen. Although fast casual has a place and will have a place, I certainly don't want to walk into Smith & Wollensky and have to go to a counter to pick up a steak. I would like to have a great bottle of wine opened by the sommelier, and I would like to have the steak served, et cetera, et cetera. So they may be right for a partial opening of many restaurants, but to get back to where we were over the years, I do hope that they are incorrect.
I think you will see a push to the high end and to the low end. You'll see a lot of that. But I think you'll still see a lot of high-end restaurants with full service. I think what'll be challenging is the middle ground.
Yeah.
The middle ground of restaurants that are, sit down dining, that are, comfortable, but aren't too expensive. Those will be very challenging from a cost perspective, and I think they already were, but I think you will see even more that, unfortunately, I think the middle ground will be the most challenged. I think things will move to the high and to the low a lot.
I've been astonished at the number of Japanese omakase tasting menu sushi restaurants with just outdoor seating that have, and also delivery, that have opened since the pandemic started at, anywhere from $95 to $250 a head. If I go into a sushi restaurant to have an omakase of 9 or 10 courses, part of the experience is to sit there at the sushi bar and interact with the chef who's making each piece and telling me what it is. And this idea of being able to open these places now in the midst of the pandemic, I mean, I hope they succeed, but I find it weird. What do you think?
I think it's definitely weird. I think they think it's weird too. I think, but I do think, New Yorkers in particular have come to love a lot of different cultural food that they may not be able to cook at home or experience at home. And being stuck, I think the desire for it may outstrip the perfect circumstance. And I also do think in those restaurants, a lot of their core customers have built a relationship with them because it is a very personal experience. And I think a lot of them are coming out to support, so I think there's an element of, were that to last for many years, would they spend that kind of money? I don't know. But I think right now, those smaller, intimate restaurants that desperately need help have built, a support of core customers. And I think they're coming out to support, which is tremendous to see. I think that is maybe a lot of what you're seeing, on a temporary basis. And it's nice to see. I think they do miss that interaction. I think so do the chefs at the sushi restaurants.
And I think that the food fits to delivery and takeout and eating at home. It's basically can be room service done in a high-end manner. And the food is also room temperature, so it's easily done. And the people on the high end are taking advantage of that, which is great for them.
That's true. That's a good point. Jennifer, do we have questions to respond to?
Yes, we do. So Ann Thomas, who was one of our guests at the last Stirring the Pot actually, said Florence mentions new restaurant openings in one of her weekly columns, kind of what you were just talking about. Given the high risk factor of the restaurant business in good times, are these folks brave or foolish to be undertaking these new endeavors at this time?
Well, let me jump in for that before we turn that question over to Alan and Michael. I can tell you that the majority of these restaurants, the new ones opening, are restaurants that were already geared up to open probably in March or April and put everything on hold because everything was locked down and they didn't know where they could go, but they already had their physical space, they had their chef, they had everything. Really, they were ready to open their doors. And a number of them now have had to pivot and accommodate outdoor dining, and a number of them are doing takeout. And from what I've heard, because they're new and because people are not familiar with them, and the novelty factor is always important, that they are doing decent takeout and delivery business because people are just curious about what's going on here. What do you think, guys?
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it's a tremendously tough spot. I don't think these people are looking to open restaurants in the middle of a pandemic. I think they were opening restaurants before a pandemic, and they are trying, to find the right balance within this. I mean, it's heartbreaking to some degree because I think it is tremendously challenging. And while I'm excited to hear you say that you think, they're, getting some interest, I would probably think in some ways it would be even more challenging because a lot of people haven't even been able to get out to see their old stalwarts and are excited just to go back to their regular places, before even going out to try new places. And the news and the ability to get the word out is so challenging with all the noise around that I think it's a very, very tough environment and will be, in my opinion, through the winter to open new places just to get people's attention and to get their interest. And I hope that people really support new restaurants because it's such a challenge and it's such a necessity. I really do hope that New Yorkers go out of their way to support these new places.
Any other questions?
Yes, so we have a question from Andrea. It's a question for Alan. You were a founder of City Meals on Wheels and serve on other charity boards. Can you talk about giving back in this way?
Well, it's not even a conversation because everybody in the food business, not only the restaurant business, but just in the food business, is aware of the problems that are all over the United States and probably all over the world as to what the pandemic and also many, many other things connected to the pandemic has caused. So something like Meals on Wheels, which is delivering food to homebound elderly people, has got just a tremendous challenge, and everybody is stepping up to it to their financial abilities. It's wonderful to see the amount of charitable organization that has been put out there and the amount that the restaurants themselves, which we have participated in, giving money to hospital workers, giving food to hospital workers, doing anything they can to step up in spite of the fact that they are being hurt very badly by this. And charities are being hurt very badly, I've been told, that it's hard for people that aren't taking money in to give money out to charity. So you put A plus B together, it becomes more difficult. But yes, everybody is working towards helping the people that can't get jobs or can't get out.
So we have another question from Mary. What will your policy about customers and employees wearing masks in your restaurant be once you reopen?
Your ball.
We currently have, a policy, all our employees wear masks throughout the organization, in all the restaurants, even when we are closed for indoor dining, going in and out of the facilities, until the government feels that it's appropriate not to have masks. That's very important. Obviously, we strongly advise customers to wear masks, whenever appropriate, both outdoors and indoors, other than when they're sitting to eat. It's obviously a challenge to the environment, but I think it's a critical necessity at this point. So, we're focused on doing all the things that are medically correct, as far as anyone knows. And, we're looking forward to the time where that will not need to be the case, but we feel like at this point, that is what needs to be the case, obviously. And it's not just masks, it's other, elements of trying to do the correct things. I think the challenge for restaurateurs is, and everyone, frankly, is it is a moving target. I don't think there's 100% clarity medically on a lot of these things for schools, for restaurants, for a lot of people. And I think you have a lot of people you're focused on and you want to instill confidence. And we're trying to do that to the best of our abilities, first and foremost. So I think our attitude is we will be medically conservative as long as it is necessary. And we will think about the health of our employees and the health of our customers and making sure they feel it's a comfortable experience first. And we will try to make that as fun and enjoyable experience as we can. But hopefully, the most important that it's a safe experience.
We have another question from Rima. Should the state fund restaurants as an essential need? So much of the lifestyle and economy of the city and individuals depends on it. What are your thoughts?
I think the state is attempting to in a degree, but frankly, the state after April and May, I don't think is in the financial ability to really do that. I think it really needs to be federal aid, and the Restaurant Act, which is currently working its way through Congress, is an important, a very, very important critical thing for restaurants around the country to survive. Without the Restaurant Act success, I think you will see like scores and scores more restaurants closing. I think what the state can do is think about systemic policies, surcharges, tipping, different things that can help make being a restaurateur a little easier in New York State going forward for the next several years. And I think they're thinking about those things. And I think it's important because restaurants are to some degree an essential need, not just for the draw of New York City and New York State, but also for the employees that they employ, and the diversity of employees that they employ, that I think are really like the hallmark of what New York is. They need to think about the types of changes they can make to make the business an easier business to operate going forward. So I think there are things that can be done at a state and federal level, and there's a lot of information out there about ones, and we definitely think people who are fans of restaurants should be trying to get out there and talk to their congressmen and their state senators and support the pushes that the restaurant industry is making. There are definitely critical things that can be done to help restaurants if you think they're important for New York State.
And I think one thing that bears repeating, and it's been said many times, but people tend to lose sight of the fact that the restaurant and let's say the hospitality business in general is the one trade where you can, with no education and probably no ability to speak English to start, can rise by hard work, can rise through the ranks to become a top chef, a restaurant owner. It is the clearest route to success for people who have no background, no training, no education. It has been marvelous for millions and millions of people. And I think sometimes the government forgets that.
100%. And those are the people that have become sort of the fabric of the melting pot of New York over the years. And restaurants have been, so much that end for them to build a life in New York. And it's been so critical. 9% of all restaurants in America are in New York City. It is such a tremendous amount of what New York City is and what the people around New York City are and the diversity. And I think that's exactly right, because you can build a career coming from anyone in the world. You can really build a career and a life through it. And that's really critical.
But also in this area, I mean, until this year, funny what the pandemic has wrought, but it was a concentrated restaurant world in a period of about 4 months, and then it was a struggle. There are predictions that now it will continue well into the fall in a more vibrant manner, which is probably going to be a good thing, particularly since indoor dining is permitted. But areas across the country, not just New York, but out here and in lots of other places, the restaurant is the door that opens for people who want to start to build a career.
For sure, for sure. And that's, I think, one of the things we love so much, and we've seen through, you know, the 5 decades of work my father's done in this industry, and employees we've had for, you know, over 40 years in many of our restaurants have watched build their way up. The dynamics, the diversity, what restaurants can bring is so critical.
Any other questions, Jen?
So we had one other thing, not really specifically a question, but Ava asked, do you have photos? And I think this was, Florence, when you were talking about how gorgeous the restaurants were inside. So if we go to the websites, are there beautiful photos of the interior, or do we have to wait?
Or you can check out Quality Branded, or for Quality Bistro, just Google Quality Bistro. There were some great articles, some great stuff in the New York Times and Bloomberg and Food and Wine, and some really beautiful photos. I think Abrico, our design firm, really outdid themselves, and it's a really beautiful and unique place. So please take a look. It's nice to have someone enjoying something positive you worked hard on these days.
Okay, well, this has been very enlightening, and I thank you both for the time you've taken and your thoughts and your most insightful views on the whole situation. And I want to thank our audience for staying with us, and I hope you enjoyed as well, and see you again in September. And support Guildhall, support your restaurants. Let's do what we can.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Florence.
Thank you.
My pleasure.